Good afternoon, everyone, or morning. Welcome today to the South Australian Business Chamber's webinar, I'd like to work flexibly, please. We're going to be looking at navigating flexible working arrangement requests, the statutory compliance requirements, and have a look at a few case law spotlights. My name's Karen Van Gorp. I'm a senior advisor and policy and advocacy, and with me is Andrew Tulich, senior consultant in workplace relations, workplace health and safety, workplace workers' compensation. And today we would like to take you on a trip to ensure that you do the right things and you know where you can come to for assistance. I'll hand you over to Andrew now.
Thanks, Karen. This webinar has been funded by the Australian Government Department of Employment and Workplace Relations through the Productivity, Education and Training Fund Grant Program. The material is general in nature and is current to the date of delivery. It is not legal advice. For important matters, please seek advice based on your own business circumstances. So the point of today's session is to be practical. By the end, you should be able to recognise a formal flexible working arrangements request, know the steps that must be taken, understand when refusal may be available, and avoid the common mistakes that are currently being tested in the Fair Work Commission. The focus of today's session is on employer process, evidence and risk management, not whether working from home is good or bad. Remote working has been increasingly expected by employees due to COVID, childcare, fuel costs, and smaller office spaces. But work from home or remote working is not the only flexibility that employees are able to request, and we will discuss who can request it and what they can request. Madeline and Philip on our business advice hotline have spoken to many employers calling for advice in relation to this. They are concerned that employees relying on specific circumstances that allow them to make a formal request, which the Commission can make a decision on, are not making these requests in the formal manner required. And employers are overlooking that. We are concerned this may backfire on the employer at some stage, especially if the employee starts believing and acting as if they have a right to the arrangement. There are several ways of making flexible working arrangements. Informally, so long as it does not breach the requirements under an award or the Fair Work Act requirements. A formal request and process under the provisions of the Fair Work Act, which are also part of the National Employment Standards, and shouldn't be confused with individual flexibility arrangements, which arise under specific awards, not all awards, but specific awards that contain that provision and allow for changing how particular clauses of those awards operate in relation to an employee. Now, they are commonly called IFAs, and IFAs are not going to be a topic of today's webinar, as they are distinct from flexible working arrangements. So an award, an agreement, state employment laws, employment contracts and workplace policies may contain rules about flexible working arrangements that are more beneficial than what is required under legislation. If that's the case, they should obviously be followed. However, none of those instruments can provide for processes or entitlements that are less generous than the provisions in the Act. So at its core, flexibility involves employees and employers agreeing on when, where, and in some cases, for how long work activities are being undertaken. It can involve remote work, changed start and finish times, compressed hours, part-time work, different days of work, job sharing, different shift patterns, or working from another location. It's not an exhaustive list, but those are some common examples. These arrangements are typically seen as enabling employees to balance their work-life goals, while they may also provide employers with greater flexibility to retain employees and otherwise still meet operational needs. Flexibility is not new, but the COVID pandemic changed expectations very quickly. The usual rules and the usual way of working that applied prior to COVID was upended, and it showed that a lot of workplaces were actually able to accommodate, and in fact it was relatively workable having people work remotely. So at the same time, many employers are now facing the challenge of trying to rebuild the office in terms of attendance, and the reasons for that may include for supervision and collaboration, customer service, mentoring, culture, and health and well-being. We also need to remember that workplace flexibility is not just working from home. So day by day, the workplace flexibility revolution is becoming increasingly ingrained in workplaces across Australia and is also expected among employees. However, as with all major changes, there are natural tensions that arise, and we have seen that many large employers, including ANZ, Origin Energy, Suncorp, and Amazon, have announced mandates for their teams to return to the office. That tension is why these requests matter. A flexible work request is no longer just a conversation about working preferences. In some cases, it has become a statutory process with tight timeframes, consultation requirements, written reasons, and the ability for the Fair Work Commission to become involved and arbitrate. On the next slide, we will look at examples that go beyond working from home. And throughout today's discussion, we will endeavour to provide you with what the law is around this fast-moving area. Now, when we say flexible work, what do we mean? So there are some examples on this slide here. Note this is not an exhaustive list, and each workplace and employee should discuss what works best for them. A lot of the discussions around flexible working arrangements also require the suggestion of alternate accommodations, and so these are good examples and good starting points, and it will be up to the employer and the employee to try and reach some sort of agreement. What is a flexible working arrangements request? So anyone can ask their employer for flexibility, but not every request is a formal flexible working arrangements request under the Fair Work Act, and therefore the legal consequences for that are very different. So a formal request for flexible working arrangements is made under the National Employment Standards and is a request by an employee to change their working arrangements as a result or because of a specified circumstance. The request might relate to a change in working hours, that's the number of working hours per week or the number of working hours per day, patterns, locations of work. The important point is the reason for the requested change. So the request must be connected to the employee's eligible circumstances. The Fair Work Act does not create a general right to a better work-life balance, and there are decisions that have in fact discussed that. It does create a right for certain eligible employees to make a request for flexible working arrangements due to having particular circumstances. So the Commission has been able to deal with disputes about these requests since 6 June 2023. If an employer refuses a request or does not provide the required written response within 21 days, whether that be the refusal or the suggestion of alternate accommodations, the employee may be able to take the dispute to the Fair Work Commission. The Fair Work Commission will try and resolve the dispute by conciliation in the first instance, and if it's unable to do so, it can arbitrate and otherwise make orders. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So in 2023, a change to the provisions of the Fair Work Act regarding flexible working arrangements were changed and came into effect. They imposed new obligations on employers, and as we've discussed, it allowed the Fair Work Commission to arbitrate disputes relating to this process. So if an employer refuses a request or doesn't provide a written response to someone's request within 21 days, that employee can then lodge a dispute in the Fair Work Commission and commence proceedings. As we said, the first step will be conciliation, try and resolve the matter by agreement between the parties, and if that's unsuccessful, then it will need to proceed to an arbitration, and the Fair Work Commission will take evidence and make its own decision in relation to the request. So it should be fairly obvious why we are saying that it is critical for employers to comply with those legal obligations under the Fair Work Act in order to prevent employees from bringing these kinds of disputes and proceedings in the Fair Work Commission, which may then also be decided completely in the employee's favour, and may result in circumstances where perhaps the employer would have been able to come to some other kind of compromised arrangement with the employee if they had sat down to have those discussions. Obviously, that's not the case in every situation, but there have been situations where an employer has outright refused on the basis of policy, and then the Commission has ordered that the employee's request be completely granted. So,
or even give something that neither the employee or the employer wanted.
Exactly.
And that is a huge risk to the employer.
Quite right. Now, in terms of eligibility, an employee is only eligible to make a formal request for flexible working arrangements if they meet two preliminary requirements. First, the reason for the employee's request has to fall within the circumstances prescribed by the Act. And secondly, the employee must have completed at least 12 months of continuous service with that employer before they're eligible to make that request. The specified circumstances include pregnancy, which was a new addition, being a parent or having responsibility for the care of a school-aged child or younger, being a carer, having a disability, being 55 years of age or older, and experiencing family and domestic violence, or having a member of their household or immediate family who is experiencing family and domestic violence. The request, as we've said, might relate to hours, patterns, or location of work, but the important point is that the arrangements need to relate to the circumstances. So as we said, the provisions in the Fair Work Act regarding flexible working arrangements do not create an entitlement to a better work-life balance, and this is the decision that made that clear. So Mr. Hutchinson was a utility trade worker and previously had a temporary flexible working arrangement allowing some remote work. In February 2025, the employee requested to work 1 week per month remotely from Townsville, citing his circumstances having school-aged children and a son with additional needs. The employer, in discussions, tried to come to a compromise and offered up to 2 weeks remote work in every 6 months, or otherwise to use leave for the purposes of the school-aged children and the commitments that he had regarding them. So the decision concerned the phrase "because of." We mentioned earlier that the request for the arrangements and that the arrangements themselves need to be because of particular circumstances. And the Commission held that "because of" connotes a cause and effect relationship where the employee's circumstances are an operative reason for making the request. It is not enough to simply have children and to desire to spend more time with them during the week. The purpose of the flexible working arrangement provisions is not to promote that work-life balance. The relevant circumstances give rise to an entitlement to make a request. However, the employee must articulate how that request is related to the specific circumstances. In this case, how the request was related to the care of school-aged children and a son with additional needs. For example, that could be by allowing the employee to pick up or drop off their children at school in circumstances where perhaps there is no other alternative. However, the applicant in this case did not clearly articulate what the causal nexus was. So that causal point. How are these arrangements going to address a particular need that has arisen as a result of the employee's circumstances? So the Commission held that although the employee had a school-aged child and referred to a son with special needs, which we will note is not actually a circumstance in the provisions, The request did not clearly show that the change sought was because of those circumstances. The request was treated closer to a personal location or lifestyle preference rather than a caregiving necessity. The Commission held that an employer is not required to accommodate a personal relocation choice or structural family living arrangements. Reasonable business grounds were also acknowledged by the Commission. The employer argued they could not accommodate the request due to the additional cost to them, lack of capacity to reallocate work, operational impracticality and safety obligations. Again, this case is just an important reminder that the arrangements need to be because of the circumstances. So for employers, the point is to test the causal nexus or the because of respectfully. Don't assume that a request is invalid, but perhaps just ask and inquire about what the eligible circumstance is, what practical need arises from that circumstance, and how did the requested arrangements address that need. So in addition to falling into the categories listed in the previous slides, to be eligible to make a flexible working arrangements request, the employee must have completed 12 months of continuous service. So this also includes casual employees, although the test is slightly different. So a casual can qualify if they've been employed on a regular and systematic basis for a period of at least 12 months immediately before making the request, and they have a reasonable expectation of continuing employment on that regular and systematic basis. If the employee does not fall into the categories we've mentioned or did not have the requisite service, they are not legally entitled to make a flexible working arrangements request. And nor can they apply to the Fair Work Commission to try and have their request or try and lodge a dispute in relation to their request. However, they may still seek to informally change their working arrangements, but in those circumstances, the provisions of the Fair Work Act do not apply, and it's essentially handled as an employee just asking if accommodations can be made in relation to their role. And so that would be handled by reference to the contract and the award and other terms and conditions in relation to their employment. Now, this is also another important one. So even where the employee is eligible, so they've got the service, they meet one of the circumstances, there are still other technical requirements that they must meet before it becomes a formal flexible working arrangements request or an eligible request. So importantly, it has to be in writing, and that's a requirement that a lot of employers overlook. The 21-day time frame only applies once you've received a formal request, and a formal request must be in writing. So sometimes it may be prudent not to press them to put it into writing, but it allows you some time to perhaps consider the situation, have discussions with the employee, and otherwise maybe suggest some other accommodations. Not suggesting that obviously you misrepresent any employee's rights, but there obviously is a little bit of strategy that goes into handling these sorts of requests because that 21-day time frame is quite tight. So as I said, the request has to be in writing. The Fair Work Commission does have templates that employees can use, so you can provide those to employees where they've requested how they might make such a formal request. And the request must set out the details of the change sought. So what arrangements are they seeking? What changes to their working arrangements are they seeking? It has to set out the reasons for requesting that change as well. So those reasons would need to show that the request is because of an eligible circumstance. All right, so an example may be, I want to work from home on Wednesdays because school pickup finishes at 3:10 p.m. and there is no available after school care. That's a stronger basis and would have been a stronger basis for Mr. Hutchinson in our previous case example than just saying, I have children, I'd like to work remotely for 1 week a month. So again, just keep in mind that the 21-day time limit doesn't start until you've received that request in writing and it meets the other requirements set out in the provisions of the Fair Work Act. All right, and now I'll hand over to Karen to run us through considering and responding to formal requests.
Thank you, Andrew. So how do you assess the request? It's before you, it's in writing, perhaps you've had discussions. We hope you've had discussions because that is really helpful, as Andrew has already pointed out. When you're considering a request, you've got three broad options. You can approve the request, you can reach an alternative arrangement with the employee, or you can refuse the request on reasonable business grounds, provided the your required process has been followed. And as Andrew has said, and we will keep on saying, the deadline is critical. The written response must be provided, your written response, the employer's written response, must be provided within 21 days of the request being received. Missing that time frame can itself open the door to a commission dispute being heard. And then, of course, the commission may make a decision that is not in your favour. So when you are considering a request, you need to consider the following questions. Because you will need to prove, if it does go to a dispute, you will need to prove, according to the legislation, that you, the employer, have had regard to the consequences of the refusal for the employee. Now that is legislation, that is very clear, and that is something that the Commission will spend some time looking at. So some practical ideas on how to deal with that is, so what are the employee's key duties? Are they something that requires the employee to be in the workplace or requires the employee to attend work at a particular time? Do any of these duties need to be done at set times or locations? Who does the employee interact with in the normal course of their work? Do they need to keep on reacting or interacting with that person or those people? And would the proposed arrangement affect those interactions? And are there any technology solutions that you might look at? Can we use video calling, instant messaging and email instead of direct interaction? And why is the employee requesting this new arrangement? As Andrew said, the employee has to provide a causal relationship with the circumstances and why they're asking for this arrangement. And what consequences might the employee face if the request is declined, i.e. the consequences of the refusal for the employee? Incredibly important. Also, you'd need to look at, is there a trial, a staged return, a partial work from home arrangement, changed hours arrangement, or a review period that you could put in place that could reasonably accommodate the circumstances but give you an opportunity to review the situation in a certain amount of time. If you approve the request, you've got to confirm it in writing within 21 days, and your response should record the agreement reached. And we'll talk about this is a word I have, contemporaneous notes in a moment. But in that discussion that you've had with the employee where you've looked at how things are going to work best for them and for you, take notes, because that is something that the Commission will actually take note of. If you can prove that you've had those discussions, that goes a long way to supporting your final decision. But that's not going to be an issue if you agree. You've got to record in writing the details of the flexibility arrangement that you've agreed to, how the new arrangement is different from the employee's previous arrangements. And we've had some issues with that where somebody has been working from home, for example, then they ask for it in a flexibility agreement, but the reason for them working from home was for a different had a different background, a different reason. And then you've got to say, okay, well, actually, in reality, you did start work in the office. You went off and did this, and now you've come back with this proposal. So you do need to step it out and actually know what the changes have been in that employee's background. When the change will commence, how long it's intended to go for. So is it going for a fixed period? Is it ongoing? There's no requirement under the legislation for it to be of a particular length. So if you don't have a date, yes, so if you don't have a date put in for a review, for example, you could be tied to this forever. So it is a good idea to make sure in your discussion with the employee there is at the very least a review date, because workplaces change, people's lives change. And you've got to have a way of reviewing this sort of agreement. I think, yes, and also you might review it, but also if there is a change to the workplace, how that is going to be dealt with as well. So there has to be an ability to step back and renegotiate.
I would say not having a review date, I don't think would be fatal, because ultimately the arrangements also need to be tied to the circumstances, and so the circumstances may not be permanent, right? And if someone ceases to meet those circumstances, then their eligibility to have flexible working arrangements would also then cease.
Good point, Andrew, thank you. But if you're considering refusing a request, there are some critical steps that must be followed, and you can't avoid them. First, and before issuing any decision, whether it's written or verbally, you must discuss the request with the employee in an effort to genuinely reach an agreement about the change. And as Andrew said before, that is better done prior to the employee providing it in writing. So encourage your employees to come to you and discuss proposals, rather than just coming to you with something already in writing, a formal request that they have, in writing it, have probably become quite attached to. And there's less room for negotiation. So be open, be welcoming, because you're more likely to be able to work out something that suits them and you. Consider alternative arrangements that could accommodate the employee's circumstances. Do that as openly and considerately as possible, because there may be some pretty private reasons why a person might need to make change, and you need to be quite respectful of that. During this discussion, you've also got to have regard to the consequences of the refusal on the employee. So even if you say, we have reasonable business grounds and we cannot at all ever accommodate what you're asking for, think about, okay, if I say that, if I have a complete full stop, where does that leave the employee? Do they have to resign because they can't change their life? So those are the sorts of things you need to think about. Or what difficulty will it leave the employee in? It's only after you've had this discussion and considered the employee's views and circumstances that the request can be refused. And it's only possible to refuse a request where you and your employee have been unable to reach an agreement, because you have to discuss the request with the employee, genuinely try and reach an agreement, consider the alternative arrangements that could accommodate the employee's circumstances, as I've already mentioned, and have regard to the consequences of refusal for that employee. You have considered the consequences, and your refusal is based on reasonable business grounds, and we'll go into those in a moment, because small inconvenience or general preferences for the employer will not usually be enough. And I will stress again, your file notes on these discussions are incredibly important. The strongest defence is usually the Contemporaneous record of discussion, alternatives considered, evidence relied on, and consequences that have been weighed. So we have an example. Well, actually, we've got several examples. Well, let's look at reasonable business grounds because we've got a couple on the slides. The reasonable business grounds exist, if any, will depend on the employee's role as well as the particular circumstances of the employee and the employer. So a larger employer might have more room to move than a smaller employer, for example. The Fair Work Commission has observed that almost all requests for flexible work will result in some cost, loss of efficiency or repercussions on customer service. That will happen, but it doesn't mean they are reasonable business grounds for refusing a request. So it depends on how big you are, how impactful that change is, how much of your business it impacts on. So you can't refuse requests that only have a small impact, as I've mentioned before, or are merely inconvenient, as doing so would be inconsistent with the spirit of the flexible work arrangements scheme. We'll look at the Westpac decision, which looks at team culture in detail in a moment. But reasonable business grounds can include excessive costs, an inability or no capacity to change other employees' working arrangements. So if it means that everyone else has to change to suit that person, that might not be possible. The impracticality of changing others' arrangements or recruiting new employees, for example, because there's a gap. Any likely significant loss in efficiency or productivity, or likely significant negative impact on customer service. The list is not exhaustive and it is not written into the legislation. It's based on decisions, but you need to be able to prove that this is a reasonable business ground. So we have an example, which is the Grattan and Bendigo Bank decision, where the mere fact that work can be completed satisfactorily from home doesn't prevent an employer from refusing a request on reasonable business grounds. In January 2022, as the COVID lockdown comes to an end, like many employers, Bendigo Bank began discussions to have people returning or regarding hybrid working arrangements. They were encouraging their employees to return to the office, and they released a hybrid working policy which required employees to come into the office on milestone days, such as birthdays. We used to get those days off. Following formal discussions on the 4th of July, Bendigo Bank informed their staff that they must return to the office for at least 2 days a week. In response to a hybrid working policy, Mr. Grattan made a request for flexible working arrangements under the Fair Work Act to work permanently from home on the following grounds. He was a carer. He provided full-time care for his wife, who suffered a severe foot injury. He's a parent and has responsibility for the care of his daughter, who's of school age and who has recently been diagnosed with ADHD, I think it was, and required uniformity in her day-to-day routine. Interestingly, he provided evidence that his wife teaches 15 high-intensity yoga classes per week, and that necessitated him being able to allow her to recover, and therefore he had more duties in the home. And he also asked that his request be granted because he was able to satisfactorily complete his work at home. So he thought that was a really good argument. Bendigo Bank refused Mr. Grattan's request because he didn't meet the requirements that he didn't meet the requirements of a definition of carer within the meaning of the Carer Recognition Act.
That's a big one, actually.
It is, that's right. So is he really a carer? So you need to consider that. While Mr. Grattan is a parent of a child who is of school age, The request to work permanently from home did not relate to his relevant circumstance and appeared to be merely a means of avoiding coming into the office. This is the Commission, not me. Bendigo Bank further asserted that their refusal was made on reasonable business grounds. Bendigo Bank referred to the benefits to the business and employees returning to work in the office, and these were accepted by Commissioner Platt. And they said they included establishing and re-establishing relationships, connections and networks within teams, enhanced collaboration both within and across teams, increase effectiveness of learning, and enhance well-being from greater social interactions and work-life separation. That's certainly why I come into work.
I completely agree.
So Commissioner Platt agreed with Bendigo Bank's position. There was no need for Mr Grattan to work permanently from home to deal with his caring responsibilities. The lack of medical evidence presented by Mr Grattan in relation to his wife's injury, the level of support reasonably required, left the Commission unable to determine whether he was a carer or not. And Commissioner Platt also considered his wife's ability to undertake yoga sessions to be at odds with his contention that he needs to be constantly home to assist her. Similarly, with limited evidence of Mr Grattan's parental responsibilities, Commissioner Platt concluded that parental and carers leave would be a sufficient option for Mr Grattan to provide care to his daughter in those circumstances. Importantly, Commissioner Platt concluded that even if Mr Grattan could meet his workload requirements from home, there are benefits, and this is something that can be quoted, there are benefits of face-to-face interactions and employee collaboration in the workplace, and that the employment relationship is a two-way street. The decision is useful for employers because it confirms that the fact the employee can perform their tasks from home does not automatically mean a permanent work from home request must be approved. The Commission accepted there can be genuine business benefits in face-to-face interactions, collaboration, learning and team connection and well-being, and the employment relationship was described, as I said, a two-way street. So the employer succeeded because the Commission wasn't satisfied with the employee's request and supported the employer's reasonable objections. So another example about saying no to requests for remote work is the Chandler and Westpac Banking Corporation decision, and we've referred to this one a couple of times now, haven't we, Andrew?
At least once, yeah.
Yes. So it's an important warning for large employers using return to office policies. So we saw previously that Bendigo Bank had a policy, but they didn't try and use that policy to make Mr Grattan return to work. No. They didn't refer to it. They didn't say everyone else is doing it and therefore you must as well.
And it was a hybrid work policy, so clearly they were at least open to some situations of work from home. Slightly different to Westpac's position in this case,
where they refused a request by a long-serving employee to work remotely to manage school pickups and drop-offs for 2 young children. The Commission scrutinised whether the asserted business grounds relied on to refuse the request were evidence-based and whether the employer had properly engaged with the employee's circumstances and the alternatives. The lesson here is that generic return to office policy is not enough by itself. Employers need to make a role-specific and employee-specific assessment. Statements about collaboration, culture or face-to-face work should be supported by evidence and connected to the actual work performed.
I think in this case as well, it was very, very relevant that this long-serving employee had conducted her duties remotely for a substantial period of time and had managed a team of people that were also remotely located. So there was no real reason for Westpac to deny the request apart from trying to rely on that blanket policy.
And it was more than just I can do my work from home.
Yes.
As well. The applicant has the responsibility for care of her two daughters, and that was quite clear, and the Commission accepted that. The applicant completed at least 12 months continuous service with Westpac. That wasn't argued. The applicant made the Fair Work Australia the flexible work arrangement request in writing, setting out details of the change sought and the reasons for the change. And the respondent did not provide a written response within 21 days, so failure 1, and ultimately refused the request of the employee. So no reasons were provided with the initial written refusal to attempt to describe the particular business grounds for the refusal or how those grounds applied to the request.
Exactly.
So this was not dealt with in any way appropriately. The employer didn't discuss the request with the applicant or genuinely try and reach agreement with the applicant about making changes to the applicant's working arrangements, the applicant being the employee, of course, when the matter went to dispute. Nor was there any evidence to suggest the employer had regard to the consequences of the refusal for the applicant. And there were quite a lot of detailed issues that would face the employee on that refusal. She would have to have really thought through what she was going to do next, because she couldn't keep on going and she could not go into the workplace.
I recall there might have been a physical relocation.
Yes, there was, and it was going to take 2 hours for her to get to work.
Yes, she wanted to work from a different branch.
Yeah, so there was a whole range of things that she tried to discuss, but Westpac actually just stood its ground and said, no, this is our policy.
That's right.
And there are formal requirements, of course, which we've mentioned before when denying a request. Your written refusal must do 4 things. It must give detailed reasons for the refusal, identify the particular business grounds that you rely on for saying no, explain how those grounds apply to this particular request. Remember, we're dealing with an individual issue. You need to state any alternative arrangements that the business would be willing to make, or state that there are none, and inform the employee about dispute resolution through the Fair Work Commission. So it's your job to actually tell them that they need to, that they have that opportunity to go to the Fair Work Commission to resolve any disputes. And then the Fair Work Commission can step in. If you refuse a request or fail to respond in 21 days, the employee may apply to the Fair Work Commission in the first instance to conciliate, and if that's unsuccessful, to arbitrate the dispute. At arbitration, the Fair Work Commission is able to make orders which may confirm the employer's business grounds for refusal were reasonable, or order the employer to grant the employee's request, or make specified changes to accommodate the employee. The employee isn't legally entitled to make a formal flexible working arrangement request. If they're not legally entitled, they still may seek to informally change their working arrangements. However, you are not legally required to comply with the Fair Work Act requirements in this circumstance. But go through this checklist when you are considering their request. Should they have actually made a formal application? And if they should, perhaps encourage them to do so, because it may turn around and bite you in the end, and the employee may think that they've applied, not provided it in writing, and still take you to the Commission. You still at least would have to go to conciliation. And that's going to take you time and money. So take a step back and do it properly. And also remember that even if that employee has no basis to make to request a flexible workplace arrangement, refusing what they do ask could be grounds for discrimination. It could be a failure to make reasonable adjustment and be unlawfully discriminatory. So do remember that. So we've got an example of Tasman, a mother of an 8-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. She's also a lawyer, and she made a request to work from home for 4 mornings a week to assist with the morning school run. Her request was refused on the basis that staff are required in the office for collaboration, client contact and mentoring purposes. Now that that's been refused, Tasman can now litigate this decision in the Fair Work Commission. And the Fair Work Commission could impose a compromise, and this is what we've mentioned before. You could get something out of this that neither the employer or the employee wanted. The Fair Work Commission could require compliance with the request or impose other conditions. Thank you, Andrew. Recent cases show that the Commission is not applying a simple pro work from home or anti work from home rule. The outcome depends very much on eligibility, the link between the request and the employee's circumstances, the employer's process, the evidence, and the practical operating context of the workplace. So let's have a look at the Catholic schools and Naden decision. Thank you, Andrew. I love you're doing that. So a Sacred Heart Primary School religious education coordinator lodged a dispute with the Catholic school after the Catholic school's Broken Bay refused her request to return from parental leave to her executive position in a full-time executive position in a part-time job share arrangement for the first 2 terms, so half a year. They argued it could not let her perform a part-time job share arrangement as a coordinator in terms 1. They offered her a couple of other alternatives, job share as a classroom teacher, and then go to her coordinator role the next year, job share as a classroom teacher, and then go to a full-time classroom teacher role, or the classroom teacher job share in terms 1 and 2 before returning to her substantive coordinator role in terms 3 and 4. So all fairly reasonable. Commissioner Mathewson found the employer had reasonable business grounds for refusing the flexibility request. The religious coordinator's critical role had to be available across the week. It was accepted there was a need for continuity of learning and teaching across the employer's key learning areas, and having 3 teachers spread across the teaching of these subjects would likely detract from the outcome. And it was always also observed that the employer wasn't serving customers who are buying widgets. Its product is of critical value to society, being the provision of education to primary school children in their formative years of life, and therefore such proposals impact on the school's capacity to effectively deliver education effectively, twice, and which risk detriment to student learning, and that should not be taken lightly. So we have a very strong position of the employer and the Commissioner supporting the employer's grounds. One more. Have we got time for one more example, do you think, Andrew?
Well, let's see.
Okay. We'll push the limits. So there is need for evidence when you are relying on reasonable business grounds, and the Ridings versus FedEx Express Australia case is a good example of this. So the employee was a part-time clearance classifier, and prior to COVID, he'd worked 4 days a week in the office. During the lockdown, he performed all his working days entirely from home. And from September 2022, he worked 2 days a week in the office and 2 days from home, in accordance with the employer's hybrid working model. In July 23, employees were notified they'd be required to return to the office for 3 days a week. Once receiving this notice, the employee made a request for a flexible working arrangement to work in the office 1 day a week, with the remaining 3 days to be worked from home. The basis for this request was the employee had 2 children who were intellectually disabled, and that his wife had also been diagnosed with a neurodivergent condition. The employer had been aware of these circumstances since October 21. However, this most recent request also provided new information that his wife was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and the children had transitioned to homeschooling. FedEx refused the employee's request to permanently work from home on the basis of business and operational arrangements. It said proposed working from home arrangement would reduce the efficiency and productivity, and as the company values its in-person collaboration, it expects employees to work in the office at least 3 days a week. Deputy President Lake considered that FedEx hadn't provided sufficient explanation for those reasonable business grounds. A generic and blanket HR answers are not sufficient alone to establish a reasonable business ground for refusing a request, he said. And he concluded that they had failed to provide a sufficient explanation for refusing the request. There was an assumption by the applicant that he's entitled to be working a flexible working arrangement without an approved request. And so there was a conflict in this. And that assumption was incorrect. So another thing that falls out of this decision is that the employee's requirement is not the status quo. The status quo is what the employer requires until there is an agreement to something otherwise.
Obviously, so long as the requirement is consistent with employment contracts and,
Yes.
and other applicable
Yes.
legislation.
Thank you. And so the Commissioner said, for example, that while collaboration with colleagues is beneficial, FedEx did not adequately consider Mr. Riding's personal circumstances or explain how approving the request could harm the business. Generic HR responses, as I mentioned before, were insufficient.
Bit of a theme arising there.
There is, definitely. I think that, yes, they are the main points for that decision and the main takeaways.
I think so.
Yeah. And then a final, I think it's our final, yes, a final, this is something that I think we may have covered most of these issues.
Another decision that probably just confirms what we've already covered.
I think so, yes. I think in the interests of time, we might move on. Except that this is the process. This case looks at process in particular. So even if everything else is in line, what is the process that is followed? And just like an unfair dismissal, often it is how it's done, not what is done, that is as important and certainly stressful to an employee. So the lesson for this one is that a return to office policy should not be treated as a substitute for statutory flexible work processes. And the businesses should discuss the impact on the employee, consider the negative consequences and mitigation options where appropriate transition, and where appropriate, transition the employee to a new arrangement in a structured way. So you don't have to do it in 1 day.
Yeah.
You can say, look, let's trial this for, a few weeks, and then increase it a few weeks after if it's working.
Yeah,
so there are different ways of addressing a change and a requirement of the employer. So if you haven't already, get yourself a decent policy or process. Understand and train your managers in that policy. So if you've got a policy but your managers don't understand the policy, you need to train them, because otherwise they will make mistakes and they will put your business at risk. Understand, this is a new paradigm. This is a new way of negotiating with employees, and therefore you have to get your head around it. So this will be recorded, and you can come back and listen to us again. And we will certainly send out our slides on this as well. And you have people like Andrew and Sophie, our other senior consultant, who can help you work through these things, put together a policy, and understand this if you need more help. And be ready for a strategic claim, because the issue is that this is another way that an employee or a union can be mischievous and put pressure on a workplace as well. So be aware that this could be used in other situations, and your process will be incredibly important. If you feel that there might be other reasons behind it, please, if you're a member, call us for help. And what's coming next? Just down the pipeline, we're waiting on a decision from the Fair Work Commission on the Clerks Award proceedings. So they have come up with a decision, but they haven't come up with the final clause content for this. They initiated a review in September 24 to modernise the Clerks Award and reflect the widespread adoption of remote and hybrid work since the COVID-19 pandemic, because the awards were not written for that sort of thing. So they actually spent quite some time going through the award and looking at what did not meet with the requirements of working from home, for example, because it's not an automatic right under the award. So the review aims to remove barriers, clarify entitlements, and create practical clauses for flexible work arrangements. So they looked at the hours of work and the spread of hours. They looked at breaks. They looked at allowances. They looked at minimum engagements and continuous hours, part-time and casual employees, and what flexibilities they have to spread work hours across the day. So it could be split shifts, for example, without breaching award requirements, and what the definition of working from home actually is. In February, the Fair Work Commission heard submissions in relation to the implementation of the entitlement to work from home to be inserted into the Clerks Award, and we're waiting for that decision. In particular, we need to remember that this will serve as a model for other modern awards. So it's incredibly important, and potentially influence a much broader workplace practices across Australia. So watch this space, be aware. Even if you aren't covered by the Clerks Award, there are other awards that this will then flow on to. So employers groups, we support the flexibility, but we oppose the mandatory work from home rights, emphasising operational practicality and avoiding unintended compliance issues, because compliance issues are a major bugbear. They are essentially what makes up a lot of red tape. And we mentioned that Victoria has introduced the first state level legal right to work from home from September 2026. So we will be watching that unfold to see how it actually impacts on the workplace. And we work very closely with our Victorian colleagues, and they will be reporting back. Businesses with fewer than 15 employees, they will have a little bit longer to bring this into effect. So how can the SA Business Chamber help? And I've mentioned this, we have Andrew, we have Sophie, we have a business advice hotline filled with very knowledgeable people answering the phone and giving you advice. We have webinars, and we will continue to roll out these webinars. So if there's an idea that you'd like to hear about, please let us know, because we are planning next year's webinars as we speak. In particular, with regard to this topic, we can give industrial relations advice, support and representation, which includes drafting and reviewing correspondence and responses to this, and representation at the Fair Work Commission proceedings if it goes that far. I think the other things that we provide are payroll compliance audits, employment contract advice, work health and safety, and workplace relations training and management courses. IR briefings for regional businesses, executive or management briefings if you think that's something that you would need. And we encourage you to subscribe to SA Business News. You can get that even if you are not a member. And we often provide stories about changes and topics that are coming up more often in the business advice hotline, for example.
Yeah.
We've left you a telephone number. And if you have something, if you want to follow up on something from this particular webinar, please email us at themaz@sabusinesschamber.com.au email and tell us if you are or are not a member, because that will depend on who you go to. But there will be some help at the end of it. And we look forward to hearing from you. And remember, make it formal. Protect yourselves.